Hello, my name's Gene Tunney. Last Monday I published a post. The true Queensland unemployment rate is 12%, so around 12% compared with the official ABS estimate of 7.9%. Now this was inspired by a point that was made in a great article by Gareth Hutchins, an ABC reporter, and he had noted that the ABS had observed that if all of the people who had dropped out of the Australian labour market over the last few months, so as a result of the COVID-19 crisis, so they've lost their jobs and then they've dropped out of the labour force, so they're no longer looking for work. The ABS has observed that if they had stayed in the labour force, then the unemployment rate would be 11.3%, which would be higher than any previous post-war record. And so I performed the same calculation for Queensland and came up with 11.8% using that ABS methodology. And I had quite a few comments on that post. I had people saying, well, the situation's much worse than even that would suggest because of all the people who are underemployed. So a lot of people have lost hours as a result of the closures associated with the social distancing measures. So I thought it would be good to record this video setting out the facts, so looking at, well, what's the logic behind that calculation in the first place, what are the data, and then looking at just how bad things are out there, so looking at a broader set of data. So that's what I'd like to do today. To begin with, we'll start with the job seeker and youth allowance numbers. The article by Gareth Hutchins that I referred to before was inspired by the ABC reporter Hutchins trying to reconcile the job seeker and youth allowance numbers. So we have over 1.6 million people on job seeker or the youth allowance version of job seeker. However, the official ABS unemployment data only show 928,000 people as unemployed. And so the ABC reporter was asking what's going on. So even though the amount of people on job seeker or its youth allowance equivalent, even though that's doubled, more than doubled, the unemployment rate for Australia has only gone up from a rate in the low 5% to 7.1%. In Queensland, it's gone up from around 5.5% to 6% to 7.9%. So what's going on? Why aren't the unemployment rate figures, the official figures, why aren't they showing the same magnitude of unemployment as the job seeker figures? It's because we've had a lot of people essentially give up looking for work. They've dropped out of the labour force. So to qualify as unemployed according to the ABS, you need to be actively looking for work. So if you're someone who had a job and you've lost it as a result of the social distancing measures, then if you've given up because you realise, well, it's just so hard to get a job now, the ABS won't count you as unemployed. So instead of moving from the employed to the unemployed category in the ABS labour force data, you will move into the not in the labour force category. The amount of people in the labour force falls, and this is reflected in the participation rate falling several percentage points. The participation rate is the ratio of people in the labour force to the civilian population 15 plus. And so we've seen a big fall in the participation rate. If we look at those different categories, we see that total employment has fallen substantially. I've got the exact figures on the next slide. And the fall in employment is much greater than the increase in unemployment. We have a sizable reduction in people in the workforce, in the labour force. Let's have a look at the figures on the next slide. These are the labour force data. So I've got employed persons and unemployed persons for Australia, seasonally adjusted data. And in this worksheet, I perform that calculation, that adjusted unemployment rate calculation. So we'll just have a quick look at this. We see that between March 2020 and May 2020, the total employment in Australia, so employed total persons, fell 835,000 people. So 835,000 people are no longer employed in Australia. However, the number of unemployed only increased by 211,500, which means that 623,600 left the workforce or left the labour force, depending on what you call it. If we add those 623,600 people to the number of unemployed recorded in May of 927,600, we get a true number of unemployed people in Australia of 1.55 million. And then if we work out the total labour force by adding together employed of 12.15 million, and we add the true unemployment of 1.55 million, we get the true labour force of 13.7 million, and we calculate the unemployment rate as the true unemployment divided by the true labour force, then we get that true unemployment rate of 11.3% for Australia. And when you perform the same calculation for Queensland, you get 11.8%. Okay, so that explains what's going on there, how that calculation's performed. We see that a lot of people have left the labour force because there just aren't any jobs or very few jobs to get at the moment. And so therefore we see that the true unemployment rate is higher than the actual unemployment rate. So 11.3%, if all the people who lost their jobs and then left the labour force, if they'd stayed in the labour force looking for work, then the Australian unemployment rate would be 11.3% versus 7.1%. Now, you might ask, why is the level of unemployed recorded by the ABS at 1.55 million, why is that lower than the 1.64 million, I think it is, recorded by the Social Services Agency, the number of people on job seeker or youth allowance other? And that has to do with different definitions. According to the publication associated with the job seeker data, New Start allowance well, that's the old name of it, or job seeker, and youth allowance other recipients may be employed part-time but within an income test limit. So you could receive a benefit while working part-time, and you only have to work 1 hour part-time to be counted as employed by the ABS. So it's very possible you could be in receipt of a benefit but counted as employed by the ABS. And it appears that that's around 100,000 Australians, and that would explain the discrepancy. Okay. One of the comments I had was that even that 12% unemployment rate for Queensland, even that's understating the scale of the problem, the scale of the unemployment we're experiencing. And that's because it doesn't take into account the underemployed workers. And that's true. I was writing a tight little post on the unemployment rate, and I acknowledge that if you look at underemployment, then you really see just how bad the situation is. So we've seen underemployment in Australia go up from around 1.2 million to 1.7 million in May. Now, underemployment is where you're working part-time, but you're not working as many hours as you'd like. And so you're counted as underemployed. So we've seen a big jump in underemployed. We know there were very large reductions in hours worked, and this is being reflected in underemployment. We see that nationally the underemployment rate has gone up to around 13%, so 13.1%. And to get a sense of what the true level of underutilisation is, you would add that underemployment rate to the unemployment rate, which is what the ABS does. Although bear in mind, this unemployment rate on this chart hasn't been adjusted for those people who've left the labour force. But let's just add unemployment and underemployment, and we get the underutilisation rate. And so this shows that around 20% of the labour force is underutilised, so either unemployed or underemployed. So they either don't have a job or they're not working the hours that they would like to work. And that's a bit over 20% for Australia. What that doesn't have in it, of course, are those people who lost their job and left the labour force. The underutilisation data there are showing that around 1 in 5 Australians are underutilised. However, if we added in the 4 percentage points or so of the labour force that have dropped out of the labour force, what you would get is you would get an underutilisation rate approaching 25%. So 24 to 25%, which would mean that around 1 in 4 Australians are underutilised at the moment. So this crisis has hit 1 in 4 Australians in the workforce, which is just absolutely extraordinary. I should note that some groups in the community have been impacted worse than others. particularly women, they've been disproportionately affected, and young people. And I'll have more to say on the disproportionate impacts in a future post or a future video. We need to see just how bad things are. We've seen some signs of things improving a little bit with the economy reopening partially. There was some encouraging payroll data, which I've got up on the screen now. They came out a couple of weeks ago, and we'll get the next instalment of those data this week from the ABS. And they've shown a little bit of a recovery from the worst of it. However, it's still early days in the reopening, and we need to see whether this continues or whether this is just a dead cat bounce. We're not sure yet. Okay. So there are a few observations of mine on the state of the jobs market in Australia at the moment. I hope you found that informative and useful. And yes, please get in touch if you have any thoughts or comments. And I hope to see you sometime in the future. Thanks for tuning in.